My name is Taifha Alexander, and I am the CRT Forward Project Director at UCLA School of Law Critical Race Studies program.
Well, thank you for joining us. And could you tell us kind of what the project is that you're involved with and how it came to be?
Sure. So with the support of faculty, staff, and students on the CRT Forward team, we have been identifying, tracking, and analyzing local, state, and federal anti-CRT activity, or more specifically, activity that attempts to restrict access to truthful information about race and systemic racism, as well as CRT as a tool to dismantle systemic racism. And so through the CRT Forward Tracking Project, which is the flagship initiative of CRT Forward, we have been able to learn that as of February 2023, there have been at least 619 different anti-CRT efforts that have been introduced across all levels of government, from Alaska to New Hampshire and nearly everywhere in between, including some more liberal or progressive states. And so as a result, our research demonstrates that the assault on CRT is widespread, it's pervasive, and it's not limited to traditionally conservative states. And so that's what we're doing. As far as how we got here, you may be asking yourself, wow, 619, that's a lot. And how did we manage to come to a place in this country and in our society where in all but one state, there are anti-CRT efforts that have been introduced? And after the public killing of George Floyd, there were businesses and government agencies, teachers, administrators, and just your average Joe and Jill who were beginning to implement practices and policies to guard against incorporating or to ensure that we can incorporate anti-racism into trainings, classroom instruction, curriculum, and to essentially lay the groundwork to dismantle systemic racism and bring us closer to realizing the nation's unfulfilled dream of being a multiracial democracy. And so it's no coincidence that the anti-CRT measures at the local, state, and federal levels immediately followed the unrealized promise of the uprisings during the summer of 2020.
Yeah, I mean, it seems very much like a backlash to that and not to a response to something that's actually happening within education. So like critical race theory, I think, is widely acknowledged not to be taught at K through 12 education. So maybe you could kind of walk us through how critical race theory came to mean this anti-racism, I think is how it was mentioned in the report.
Right. So critical race theory, or CRT for short, is both a practice and a theory that helps us understand how race and racism has shaped laws, policies, and structures despite civil rights advancements, and is also committed to changing the laws that have produced and reified racial inequality over time. And so CRT was founded by a diverse group of anti-racist legal scholars and professors in the 70s and 80s. And since then, there's been this emergence of scholarship that stems from CRT. And the purpose of it is to deconstruct and reconstruct a critical understanding of how historical subordination has operated across different social identities over time. But one of the interesting things about critical race theory is this comparison, right? So understanding or studying history to better understand how we have come to the places that we are today. And so I think what we saw in the summer of 2020 was this nascent movement amongst educators to be more intentional about the types of histories that were being discussed in classes and researched and analyzed and critiqued. And while that might not be critical race theory specifically, it does have its foundation in critical race theory, which isn't a bad thing, right? If a teacher wants to talk about environmental injustice, right, then it's kind of important to discuss redlining, right, and how that might have contributed to the current environmental issues that are impacting particular environments and communities. And so they're not the same, but they are related, right? They're not sisters, but cousins. And so those things are important, you know, in order to ensure that students have access to information and to tools to help address the most pressing social and racial justice issues of our time.
And it became highly politicized during the Trump administration, we know, but specifically it's this Executive Order 13950 and a right-wing activist named Christopher Rufo, right? And he kind of brought all this together, and this is kind of the foundation of what you're tracking, correct?
Right. So it is very much so. You know, after, you know, activists and folks were demanding some racial justice and some changes as it related to policies and procedures, conservative media outlets denounced those efforts and critiqued them in ways that weren't appropriate, really, and labeling anti-racist critiques as racist themselves. And so what we saw during all of this was that anti-CRT architects started publishing articles and appeared in numerous outlets denouncing critical race theory and urged the government to act against the promulgation of critical race theory and its ideas. And so after some White House consultations with Christopher Rufo, the most prominent conservative activist leading this anti-CRT initiative, then President Trump issued Executive Order 13950. And that executive order is oftentimes referred to as an equity gag order. And what it essentially did was prohibited federal agencies and recipients of federal funding from teaching and training, quote, divisive concepts. And that's a term that would be marshaled in future anti-CRT measures. And these divisive concepts, to be clear, are essentially just distorted descriptions of systemic racism and efforts to dismantle it. And so in the report, we quote critical race theory, or CRT, a lot, because what we have learned through studying this is that critical race theory as a term has been co-opted, misdefined, and intentionally weaponized in order to cement political power within an extremist branch of a political party. And so it's important to name that. It's important to recognize that. And it's also at the same time important to have people understand what the contributions and positive impacts of critical race theory really are.
Yeah, and that's the divisive concepts are quite amazing. And when I read the actual language of the executive order, it's pretty incredible. I mean, anti-racism is the best way to say it. So, right. I mean, just I think one of the language that I hear a lot is that, quoting that the can't be made to feel discomfort, guilt, anguish, or any form of psychological distress on account of his race or sex.
Right. Yeah, and that one is really like left field one to attribute to critical race theory. And I think I can understand parents who do not want their children to feel guilty for learning or for who they are, who it is they think they are, they perceive themselves to be, right? And so it's important to note that critical race theory doesn't make all white folks oppressors and all people of color victims, right? Instead, what critical race theory does is demonstrates ways in which law has operated to create this falsehood of a social hierarchy, and aims to correct that and to ensure that we all have access to opportunity and to be who it is we want to be. And I think that that particular divisive concept is one that's been especially pervasive, just because of what I mentioned. Parents don't want their students to be harmed, and critical race theory doesn't advance that that is what should happen. Instead, it looks to the ways in which subordination has operated and has created this falsehood of a racial hierarchy. And so, yeah, all of the concepts have been used and attributed to critical race theory in a way that's not at all in alignment with the theory itself, which is unfortunate, because I think a lot of the people who are calling for the banning of critical race theory, if they knew what the theory really was, they would be in support of it, because it's not just a theory for folks that are on the margins. Yes, it's true that storytelling, especially for people who have been historically subordinated, is a major part of critical race theory. But at the same time, the theory advances collaboration and community in a way that is going to be integral for all of us to succeed.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, especially reading Derek Bell's work, that comes through very clearly, which we did last month. So that was, but anyway, let's get into kind of how these laws, and well, they're not always laws, are they? What you're tracking, and maybe you could kind of give us an overview of what it is. And I kind of want to return to that concept that we were just discussing a little bit later, and how it kind of plays out through these different things that are being introduced through school boards and legislators and things like this. Maybe you could give us a focus, kind of like what these measures focus on and how they're being enacted.
Sure. So there are a lot of phenomenal think tanks and advocacy organizations that are focused on doing the good work of tracking and identifying and making information available as it relates to anti-CRT measures. The uniqueness that CRT Forward presents in this arena is that in addition to tracking federal and state legislative measures, so bills that are introduced at the state level or at the U.S. congressional level, we're also looking at local measures, right? So local measures could include school board resolutions and policies, county resolutions, city level resolutions, as well as state legislative or state non-legislative actions. So whereas some folks might just be tracking the state legislative, we're doing it all, right? So executive orders that have been issued. We're also looking at state school board regulations, as well as attorney general opinions and statements by school boards, right? And the purpose of this all-inclusive approach really allows us to understand the full scope and magnitude of these attacks, right? And to put it into context even further, states like California and Massachusetts, for example, there haven't been any state level introduced measures in those areas, but there have been local measures that have been introduced. And so, for example, in California, there were 11 introduced anti-CRT measures, and 7 of those have been enacted. And so that impacts 100,000 students in California public schools. And so that's significant enough for us to want to track and to want to analyze and want to help people better understand. In fact, most of the California activity has been concentrated in Southern California, which is also an interesting data point. And so our data is very inclusive in thinking about all these authority types. And the purpose behind that is to allow people to have access to information, right? So if something had been introduced in Illinois, for example, right? And it was at the local school board level, and it was introduced and it was going to be discussed further at the next school board meeting, then hypothetically, a parent or someone interested in this local measure could learn more about it and go to the school board meeting and hopefully share some additional context that might challenge this anti-CRT measure. And so that was the purpose behind why we're so extensive in our search. We also include statements as well, because those, while they don't have a binding effect, right, of law, they are contributing to chilling effects as well. So while a school board might not necessarily introduce a regulation, if they say something like, well, critical race theory isn't taught here, but a teacher is teaching history in a way that as we discussed earlier, ties laws and policies from the past to the lived experiences of their students today, then they might not be sure if that's okay. And as a result, because this is their livelihood, they might not teach this particular thing in this particular way. And so it's important to us to have as much information as possible to really paint a clear picture of the trends and patterns in these anti-CRT measures and activity that we've identified.
I also think one of the most invaluable parts of your research and data collection is the challenge to the idea that this is an organic movement, that it's just springing up kind of on its own in these different locations and at school boards. And one of the things that you've kind of tracked is the pathway by which these ideas are being introduced into school boards. And it's an organized campaign, correct? And
right.
Some of the, mainly Moms for Liberty and who they are and how they got the way they are.
I don't know if I can get into how they got the way they are. But again, this all stems from this movement in the summer of 2020 where folks were demanding change. And that sort of demand is scary for folks who feel that they have something to lose, when in actuality, what it really is that we are all in a better place when we all have the opportunity to succeed. And so the organized campaign on anti-CRT is one that's extremely well funded. It's one that's extremely organized. It's one that responds and evolves like a living organism. And so one thing that we've noticed is that a lot of these conservative extremist think tanks have model legislation. And so what happens is they share this model legislation widely, and then different extremist conservative actors or policymakers introduce these model legislation into state legislatures. There are some that are even school board specific. And so a lot of the backlash bills, especially from 2021, were following kind of this formulaic model legislation that was produced and circulated among conservative extremist actors. And so that's one part of the organization. A second part is that a lot of these think tanks are galvanizing people to run for school board. One of the things we really noticed last year was that there was this surge of school board candidates who were now taking stances on race and education, or against critical race theory more specifically. And so what we found was that there were a lot of school board measures in different localities that were now introducing anti-CRT measures that hadn't been before. And so one example was in Douglas County in Colorado. And we essentially formalized what we call the anti-CRT candidate blueprint. So what was happening was that these folks were running for school board on a platform to either introduce anti-CRT measures or to roll back diversity, equity, and inclusion measures that had already been passed. And then the second step was that these candidates were endorsed by these political action committees that were extremely well funded. And so a part of being endorsed by these PACs was that you would also have to commit to dismantling critical race theory, as they would call it. And then the third step was to essentially get into the elected seat to introduce that anti-CRT measure, or to roll back DEI initiatives. And then the fourth step was to rinse and repeat. And so we saw that a lot in the local school boards, and it was coming out in our data when we were tracking different anti-CRT measures that were introduced at the local level. And again, this is something that folks wouldn't be able to see or to critique or to analyze if the focus of identifying and tracking measures was limited to state legislative activity. And so those are just a couple of ways in which these organizations have been extremely organized and ahead of the game in a lot of ways. And then these model measures that have been introduced on the anti-CRT side, a lot of times evolve, right? So if you go on websites, if you go on the Moms for Liberty Facebook group, they're saying things like, oh, well, maybe we don't, in these model measures, directly name or target higher education anymore, because there seems to be this academic freedom piece that makes it challenging for anti-CRT measures to stick at the higher education level. So now the approach is, well, we're going to challenge tenure for anyone who teaches critical race theory. And that's an example of the evolution of this, starting from Executive Order 13950 until where we are today. It's been a lot of evolution and change in the level and the focus of the attacks.
Well, and the rinse and repeat piece is interesting too, because now we're seeing a shift, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, from like the CRT focus to the don't say gay, trans.
Yep.
Rights. And that's so it's like they've won against the CRT to the degree that they can, and now they're moving on to the piece of the world.
Right. Absolutely. This thing is a living organism, like I said, and these are all branches of the same vine, right? The attacks on critical race theory, the attacks on LGBTQIA plus youth and gender affirming care. All of these are part and parcel of a larger campaign to erode civil and human rights. And so it feels daunting. But what our level of intervention is at CRT Forward is really providing the information that people need in order to be informed, and in order to better understand what's going on, right? Because in order to correct something, you must first be able to assess the problem. And so we're trying to help folks assess, and it does seem overwhelming. It does seem daunting, but in actuality, it shouldn't be, because with all of this information that we have, we're able to expose gaps in logic. We're able to expose issues as it relates to vagueness in a lot of these policies, which are under constitutional challenges. And so there's hope. There is hope.
Well, yes, and I think I think this is a good place to kind of wrap it up. But I mean, if you were going to kind of give an elevator pitch for someone to go to the website and investigate on their own, what are some of the features that they can play around with, look at, and get involved in their own local politics?
Sure. So the database is extremely user-friendly. There are lots of tabs for folks to explore. The most pertinent one might actually be the interactive map tab. So on that map, you're able to filter for specific activity. If you're only interested in a particular state, you could click on that state. If you're interested in local trends, you can use the filter function. And if you only want to know about Attorney General letters, for example, you could click that button there, and then you'll get highlights of where Attorney General letters have been issued. And then even using the table feature, you're able to get a list of everything so that you can see what's going on. And then what's even more interesting is that you can see the progress status of the activities. So while something might have been introduced, you can also see if things have been adopted, rejected, expired, or revoked. And so that really gives you an accurate picture of where we are as it relates to anti-CRT measures that have been introduced across the country.